smart to do it, which is really scary. But hopefully, they've got caught very quickly. I hope that's it in itself. Oh.
Whether I talk to you about what we do, because we've got exercise regime for musicians, and then people think we just sit there and a number of people who
they have a little this whole facility to promote the entertainment of
No, I know. It's like a competition where you run across mountains
on and off. Nothing. Yeah, that's right. My hand up. I know a few people involved, so I got my mobile number. Happy to support it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Great opportunity to showcase.
Yeah, and you have to think about that sort of stuff. You actually go forward, you actually keep doing what you're doing in practice, and it yeah.
Sure, people with your pen as they finish.
Ladies and gentlemen, one and all, I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that we're meeting today on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their elders past and present and thank them for their continuing contribution to our culture, and I would say particularly given this forum not only in the world of art but in the world of sport. I'm Robin Archer, the Creative Director of the Centenary of Canberra, and thank you all for coming here to discuss the similarities and possibly the differences between art and sport. My job is a simple one today, simply to introduce you to the panel who's going to be discussing this. From the ABC, Beverley O'Connor. From the world of sport, world champion Rob de Castella. From the world of music, Philippa Paige, who's a symphonic musician. And David Pledger, the Artistic Director of Not Yet It's Difficult and the Director of the group that you've seen here today, the Training Squad, who are all, put your hands up, also here today. Thank you, Training Squad. And David is that mix of somebody who has played a lot of sport in his time, had the potential of being a professional sports person, and has gone into the world of the arts instead. Fascinating discussion, and I'm going to hand over to Beverley. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here at this fantastic facility and to be taking part in this conversation. I feel rather smug about this conversation, I have to be honest with you. I'm a journalist and a broadcaster, and I have been for well over 20 years. I've also had the privilege of serving on the Melbourne Football Club board and have been deeply involved in sport. But I began my life at age 3 as a ballet dancer. And my mother desperately wanted me to be a little prima ballerina. And life changed. I grew a little bit more than I should have for a prima ballerina. But, you know, for many, many years, that was my life. For 16 years, I went to art school, to ballet school. That's basically what I matriculated in then, as that was called in those days. And that was my life. And but I also did a lot of theatre and a lot of acting. So that was my life. But I always secretly wanted to go off and play hockey with my sister, and I wanted to learn how to play tennis, and I was never allowed to do any of that sort of stuff. And then when I sort of grew up and decided to become a journalist, my life went in a completely different direction. My mother sadly passed away at the age of 48 from breast cancer. I think thankfully to some degree, because she'd be horrified that I ended up in sport. But it was funny, and I won't take much longer, but when I became the deputy chair of the Melbourne Football Club board, I had to do many rounds of interviews and often represent the club. And Sam Newman, who I'm sure all of you know, and I hope you do, so I don't have to explain who Sam Newman is. But in any event, I often had to go on Triple M and chat to him. And my very first interview, I thought, well, I know what he's going to say. What the hell would you know about football? Because that's the kind of question he'd like to ask. And so I thought about this long and hard, and I thought, no, I do know a lot about it. Because I trained for 15 years, 4 hours a day. I, you know, couldn't eat this, couldn't eat that, couldn't do many things that I wanted to do. I was very committed, very focused, very disciplined. So I went on with that as a, well, in fact, I didn't play football, but I did something that was very, very similar, because I really believe it is incredibly similar. The disciplines, the sacrifices, those kind of the support networks you need around you are so, so similar. So when he did, you know, typically launch with his question about what the hell would you know about football, I explained, to which he very quickly said to me, oh, how delightful, can you wrap your legs around my neck? I thought about it for a second. I said, well, actually I do Pilates these days and I could snap your neck. We've been firm friends ever since, if you can be with Sam. But look, it's a wonderful conversation, and I think I might get David, as Robin very pointed out so well, that, you know, who's really made a bit of a life art about this. He started off playing in the VFA, the old VF, well, it's now the VFL, or the old VFA, went to Essendon to train. And
Melbourne, actually.
Oh, Melbourne,
Yeah.
you did tell me Melbourne, Melbourne, my football club, I should have known that. But you're an Essendon supporter, that's why I got confused for a second. Yeah, we'll forgive you for that. You're looking very well. Any supplements?
Only improved.
You improved.
Isn't that the phrase? Only improved.
Only improved. But we're going to individually ask our guest speakers to talk to this topic for a little while, and then we're going to discuss it amongst ourselves and throw it open to you as well. So David, why don't you kick us off and talk about why you discovered there was this absolute blend and these similarities?
Thanks, Beverley. When I realised that I was failing at being an elite footballer, I was at the same time discovering the joys of performance, primarily as an actor. And I really felt, I think my first experience is that experientially they're quite the same. They're quite the same. When you're, and most of my experience really is in team sport. So when you're on a football field and there's a crowd around you, the adrenaline that runs through your body is as much to do with physical activity that you're undertaking as it is to do with the fact that you are being watched, you're being regarded. People are seeing what you do, your attempt to achieve certain physical tasks, and in a team context, what I'll call psychological tasks. You are trying to achieve as a team one objective, and that objective usually is to kick a goal in football. But along the way, there are many different objectives. In performance, particularly in the physical arts, it's not dissimilar. Essentially, you are being watched by an audience. You have a set of tasks in front of you that you need to achieve. The difference is in the psychological landscapes, I think, because in the psychological landscapes of being an athlete, they are really defined by, in team sport, the sport you play and the team that you're in. It's about chemistry. It's about who you have in your team. In terms of acting, like play, for example, and that was when I first trained as an actor. When I first trained as a performer, was an actor. You are engaging in a psychological realm, so you're trying to usually pretend that you're somebody else with a whole bunch of other people who are pretending to be somebody else. And if you take that too far, it gets a little bit sort of crazy. But anyway, that's theatre. So in that you are engaging a physical and mental practice in which technique, skill, talent needs to be mixed together in some alchemy that changes every single moment. And in that way, for me, it's very much like what happens when you play team sport. You are essentially trying to achieve something different in every single moment. Whereas in performance, you understand the outcome, you know what the outcome will be. The process every single night is completely different. In sport, you don't really know what the outcome is until you cross over the finish line or until the siren goes. But the process is essentially a very similar process. And so when I started to think about this in terms of leaving sport, and I actually took a lot of it with me. So a lot of my physical practices, when I work with groups like Training Squad, they have a lot of performance practices that are informed very deeply by the experience of being in an arena, being watched by people, and organising your body to communicate a physical language so that the audience understands what your intention is.
Beautiful. Thanks, David. Let's move to Philippa, and Philippa and I had dinner last night, and I'm going to dob on you. She's only ever seen one football match. But
all the way through.
Yeah. But Philippa, of course, is a violinist with the Sydney Symphony Orchestra, and she's really also taken on a big role in terms of mentoring and teaching as well. That's something that she's incredibly passionate about, which is really wonderful, because I think that's often when the elite teaches the young that it really makes all the difference. Philippa, talk a little bit about what you've been thinking about with this rather challenging topic.
Okay. Well, the first thing that occurred to me is that most people, so often I'm asked, I say I'm a musician, and they say, oh, that's lovely. What do you do for a living? You'd be surprised. That still happens. So the first thing I thought I would just describe very briefly what we actually do. I mean, I play in the Sydney Symphony, and a typical week for us would be rehearsing for a couple of days, Monday and Tuesday. We'd rehearse for about 5 hours each day and maybe practice a bit, do a dress rehearsal on Wednesday morning, a performance on Wednesday night, maybe another performance, a matinee on Thursday, and probably another one on Friday night and on Saturday night. No good for your social life. You're always working when everybody else is partying, but that's life. And around that you're fitting your own personal practice and all the other things that one has to do to keep life running. And so I suppose you'd probably be playing physically for probably about somewhere around about 30 hours a week, actually physically doing whatever it is that you do on an instrument. And then, what do we actually do? We don't just play at the Opera House. We do play there a lot of the time, but not all of the time. We play in various other places around the city. We travel around regional New South Wales, playing in schools and wherever we can find a concert hall big enough to fit us in. And then we break up into groups and we play in old age homes and hospitals and various things like that. We do schools concerts, some of them at Olympic Park, with the big sports arena, which is great. And we do commercial concerts as well. We do commercial backings. We even got to work with Sting a couple of years ago. That was such fun. That was just amazing. And a couple of weeks ago we did a backing for Pirates of the Caribbean and Cercle Symphonique, which was quite amazing. Wonderful circus performers. So who are we? There's about 100 of us from a number of different backgrounds and countries and lots of different instruments, of course. So that's what we do. As far as getting to be a musician, the training is very similar to what Bev was talking about, being a ballet dancer or being a sports person. You start really young, and you have to practice a lot. There's a lot of skills to learn. Whatever instrument you play, you might start. I mean, if you might start as young as 4. You might not start till 10. Or you can't really pick up some of the bigger instruments until you're a little bit bigger. And we spend hours practicing technique. Just the coordination of being able to make a sound out of it, whatever it is that you're trying to blow or scrape, and getting your fingers to land in the right place at the right time and to beat the music, and then you've got to learn to work in a group, the team aspect. It goes on and it goes on. Probably by the time you're early 20s, you might be ready to actually go into the profession, and there's still a gulf between what you will have learned at the university level and a degree and actually being able to do it professionally, which is where the mentorship that you were talking about comes in. And we actually have a lovely program in the Symphony where we have young musicians from the universities who come in. We audition them like a professional audition. If they pass muster, they come in and we work with them. We do the education concerts together, and it's a free-for-all. They can ask us whatever they like, and we can offer advice. And it's a wonderful way of bridging that gap between being able to do it and knowing how to do it in a professional context. So that's sort of just a little brief rundown of what it's like getting there. It's not an easy profession, of course. We train more probably than can actually get a job in an orchestra, and there's not very many opportunities. Everybody thinks they're going to... I thought I was going to be a soloist too. We all think we're going to be soloists until you realise that really you can't have all that many soloists, especially in Australia. So you need to think about something else. And that, if you're fortunate, you'll get a job. You'll get a job that's got some permanency to it. Otherwise, you might be, working in a freelance capacity. There's so many diverse ways of making a living out of music. Often not terribly well remunerated. Now, our challenges are very similar again to sports people. We get injured. We have lots of, I would say probably 80% of us at some stage of our careers would have some sort of injury that impedes our playing or stops it altogether for a while. And as we were talking about, with David, that has a profound, apart from it being upsetting from the point of view of not being able to go to work, not being able to earn a living, the psychological side of it is truly horrendous, because you think, well, who am I? You've spent your whole life being a violinist, and then you can't do that. And you think, what if I can't fix this? Who will I be? It's a terrible. And I can imagine this must be exactly the same if you spent all your life learning to work so hard towards something, and then you in the sports or whatever, and then you get an injury and you can't do that. It's the same. I mean, what's going on in the mind must be enormously similar. We have a lot of musculoskeletal problems with necks and arms and shoulders and backs. Wind players have when you see us on stage, it all looks so elegant and beautiful, and whatever's going wrong, we hide it, as you no doubt do as well as sports people. But it doesn't mean that your arm is not hurting, and you don't come off sort of cursing and saying, I feel like I've run a marathon, and you haven't got a headache the next day and everything's aching and you've got to go to the physio and so on. The wind players get problems with the little facial muscles. You wouldn't think of that, would you? But blowing an oboe or a clarinet or a trumpet is actually quite physically demanding on muscles that were most certainly not designed for doing anything like that, nor were we designed for that matter to stay in that position for sort of 30 hours a week or scrub away on a violin. So there are a lot of physical similarities. We manage those. We end up at the sports clinic just like you guys quite often, because that's where the expertise is. We've got a special group called ASPA, the Australian, I can never remember this, Australian Society for Performing Arts Healthcare. And that was founded by, I think, the physiotherapist and the doctor who travelled with us on tours. They got so interested in musicians that they formed, and that means that we can get specialist medical help for whatever goes wrong. It's just fantastic. Our orchestra is very supportive. If there's something wrong, they'll say, well, you try this, or you try these different experts in the field. They'll let us come back on a reduced workload and so on, so that we can get back into work. The other thing that troubles us is hearing loss. That's probably not a big issue for sports people, but for us, actually, you have no idea how loud it is on stage in the middle of an orchestra. It's unbelievable. We all have fitted earplugs, which we discreetly sort of put in every now and again, if it's just a bit much. And sometimes you'll see screens, particularly behind the bassoons and the violas, so that they don't get blasted onto the floor by the trombones. And sometimes behind the violins, because the horns are quite loud as well. So we have that issue as well. And then I think, well, why do we do it? And it's the same, I'm sure. And it's just an obsession. I mean, with my students, if they want to, if I think they're not sure, I say, well, you could think about doing this, or you could, if I can't, or think about doing that. If I can't talk them out of it, then I think, okay, well, I'm probably going to meet them in the profession at some time. So we go all out to make sure it works. But it's an obsession. It's an obsession. You spend all you can't stop it. You just have to practice. It's fascinating. You can spend hours playing and just thinking about sound or a particular sort of technique. It's totally engaging. We practice for hours and hours and hours, especially when we're young, and often the youngsters get injured as a result because they think they're invincible at that stage. And it's the same thing you said with the buzz of a performance. When you do a really amazing performance with a fantastic conductor, you think it's just such an adrenaline rush and such an absolute. You just come off stage and you float. That's why we're so nocturnal, you see. You can't get rid of the adrenaline. So.
You have to come down from that, absolutely. We'll talk more about that rush in a little moment. Deeks, I guess you would know more than many others just what an absolute obsession Australia has with its sports people. They're idolised, they're looked up to as role models. When you were training, when you were competing, and even now in the work that you do, did you ever think about the similarities between arts? Did you ever get inspiration from art?
Look, it's a fascinating topic, I think, and we were just talking downstairs with Robin and the others just about the whole concept of the interrelationship, the things that are similar and the things that are different between the arts and between the sports. There are so many things listening to both of you guys talking, which are exactly what an athlete feels. For me, I've always been inspired by the arts. When I was running, I wanted to be the best that I could be, and I wanted to dominate the world for a period of time. And that was the dream that I had deep inside me, the flame that I fueled and burnt, and created the obsession for me to give everything that I possibly could. And I drew from any source that I could find to fuel that flame and that obsession. And when I went to my very first Olympics, which was the Moscow Olympics way back in 1980, I was 23 years of age. I was idealistic. The backdrop to Moscow was the Russians that invaded Afghanistan. Anyone old enough here to remember? And sport was being used as a political tool to try to hurt the Russians. So there's a whole the boycott of the Moscow Olympics was very topical, and myself and a group of other young idealistic Aussie athletes were very much opposed to, in principle, to sport being used as a political tool, especially when Australia and all of the other Western countries were still quite happy to trade. They were quite happy to exchange industry and trade, but wanted to use sport to send this message. But for me, when I went to Moscow, I took one cassette song or CD. Back in those days, there was no MP3 players, there was no Walkman. I had this massive, great big little a portable stereo that I thought was wonderful, and one cassette, and that cassette was The Man of La Mancha, and the song that I played was was to dream the impossible dream. You know, to dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe, to strive when your arms are too weary, and to run where the brave dare not go. And that to me was a fuel that flamed my obsession inside me, and you know, I was not competing, I was doing something much greater than just going out and running a marathon. And that's the way I approached all of my training and all of my sport. So I think in a lot of ways, when I look at what I did as an athlete, I see myself as a performing artist. I was driven by the competition, not just to win, but to use the competition to inspire a better performance from myself. And that was the obsession that I had, to retire and to be able to look back knowing that I had no regrets, that I did everything that I could possibly do throughout my career to be the best athlete that I could possibly be. And you know, when I first started, I was a plodder. You know, it's great to have my mum here. Mum's up from Melbourne for the weekend, but you know, when I first started, I was an ugly duckling. I was, you know, my feet splayed out, and my build is not the ideal build for a distance runner. But it was the thrill of seeing my performances improve, the personal enjoyment and the satisfaction, the camaraderie and the mateship of my training people, and you know, the support of the coach that I had, who's still one of the closest friends that I have, and that's what drove me. You know, these days I don't do as much running, but I now do a lot of traditional martial arts. You know, I've been doing traditional Okinawan karate for over 13 years, and there's a big difference between sports martial arts and traditional martial arts. Sports martial arts are about, you know, points and medals and competition and winning. You know, the judo, the boxing, taekwondo, all of these things are about having, you know, people pitted against each other. The traditional martial arts are about self-improvement and self-development through a martial framework. And whether it's a physical development of flexibility and agility and mobility and those things, or whether it's a spiritual development, they're very different. And there's not a great mix and crossover between the sports martial arts and the traditional martial arts. You know, sort of the traditional martial arts of Tai Chi and Aikido and other things, you know, sort of are poo-pooed by the sports martial artists and vice versa. The traditional martial arts resonate strongly with me because probably of my background, even though most people know me as a sports person and as an athlete. I think it's really the personal drive to be the best that I could be. You know, these days with our Indigenous Marathon project, working with these Aboriginal and Island men and women, what I'm trying to do is to promote a culture of self-worth. Within our Indigenous population, we non-Indigenous have, in a couple of hundred years, destroyed the richness of a culture that's been around for 50,000 years. And through that, there is a lack of, what I've seen, a lack of self-worth and personal integrity and pride. And I think that running and certainly marathons are things that you can do that test you physically, but more importantly, they test you personally and spiritually. And when you do finish, the glow that you feel, it's more than adrenaline. It's a deep-seated sense of enhanced self-worth. And what I've seen through the 21 Indigenous men and women that so far we've taken to the finish line of a marathon is when they cross the finish line, it's like, you know, yes, you know, I've done this. And you feel that every time you do a training run. I'm sure you feel it every time you do a really hard training or practice session. And that's what I want to try to use sport to promulgate and reinforce and echo. Sport per se is sort of competitive. The arts to me are about communication, or it's about expression. It's more of an expression of self. And I've thought long and hard over the last few days trying to understand what I'm going to say. But to me, it's a fascinating area, and I think that both the sport and the arts can learn so much from each other.
And let's pick up on that, because I think, what we're hearing here is a theme of self-worth, achievement, satisfaction, development, which you're getting in both of these. So you use the word poo-poo between traditional and sporting martial arts. How do we start breaking down the barriers? David, let's just throw this open to you for a discussion here. How do we stop a snobbery, whichever way it's going, and how do we start breaking down the barriers and learning from each other?
I think the way that I look at the dynamic is often that and it usually comes from performing arts, and often from, I would say, theatre as an art form. There is a real jealousy in terms of sports because of the amount of funding that sports people get. And I think from the sports side, there's actually a fair amount of indifference to the arts. One of the things that I've really tried to cultivate, really in just the small circles that I work in, conversations that I have with people in the arts, is that for me there are no boundaries, especially when you work in the physical arts. There are no boundaries. The only boundaries are constructed boundaries. They're made by others so that you don't see what is essential. And I think where Rob's going is a philosophical dimension, and the philosophical dimension cuts the same way between arts as it does with sport. I often look at sports people and I think, so why do they have what they have? What is that? Is it just about a national obsession with sport? And I've done some recent study looking at issues of advocacy and representation. And I think sports people are much better at advocating and representing their interests than arts people are. There's a tendency for the arts to live in a ghetto, and a tendency for the sports people to actually kind of embrace the world in a bigger way. And I'm not sure if the chicken and the egg. I'm not sure what happens. Can they do that because Australia as a country celebrates sports people, or does Australia celebrate sports people because they participate at every level, not just at the level of activity, but also at the level of governance? And I found that a very interesting thing. I mean, I think of the AFL. I mean, Andrew Demetriou, a former football player, he's actually the head of the AFL. Is the Australia Council headed by an artist? No, they're not. For me, they're questions that I think from the arts point of view, to look at sports is not. There is no benefit. There's absolutely no benefit in looking at sport in an adversarial way. The benefit is to actually understand what is essential and complementary, to appreciate the difference, and then to learn and to make something, because both sport and the arts are part of culture, and that's where the shape of it is.
But it's about getting that value, equal value, because I do think there is an indifference among sports people because they know that they have their place in Australian society. Talk to that competitive spirit, Deeks, because I think that pushing themselves, essentially sport, even if we're saying that it takes very similar qualities and dedication and obsession, sports people are much more upfront. They are used to competing. They're used to knocking out the other person to get where they want to go. Does that mean they get hurt?
Well, it's sport's pretty simple. It's
you win or you lose.
Look, you follow the rules. You've got an umpire. Nothing gets more simple than running a marathon. You start, you finish, and you get there as quick as you can. but people, I'm told, will actually watch 2.5 hours of marathon running. So it's pretty simple and straightforward. The arts are a lot more complex. There's you need to have an appreciation and an understanding and an education, and I think and maybe I don't want to have this interpreted negatively, but there's almost a bit of a snobbery sometimes in the arts. You go along to the National Gallery and you look at someone looking at a painting and they're talking about whatever in such incredible terms, and you're looking at it saying, God, it looks like a piece of rubbish, or whatever it happens to be. And it's the same with classical music. It's the same with ballet. It's the same with opera. You need to have a much deeper and richer education and exposure to, I think, appreciate the nuances and the beauty and the subtleties. Sport's pretty straightforward. Aussie rules is kick the ball and get it from the middle to the goal.
I was going to say, Philippa, is there a snobbery? Do you think is there a little bit where art has to get off their high horse and?
Well, that's often said. If anybody would listen. No, it's interesting what you're saying, because and you've told everybody that I don't ever seen one football game, so
Sorry,
I didn't grow up.
ruined your credibility.
I didn't grow up in a household where anyone played football. Dad hated it, so that was that. We didn't watch it, and and I didn't learn anything about it. So when I look at it, I don't know I can see skill. I can see enormous enthusiasm and skill, but I really don't know. With a lot of the games, I don't know what's going on, simply because I wasn't educated, and education is the issue. I didn't grow up with it. I wasn't educated in it. It does, but on the whole, I think in society, everybody. Sport is everywhere. Children do sport. They grow up, and so the little ones play football, or they play netball, or they play whatever they play. So they know what the game is about. They know what the rules are. And so they know what it's like to do it. So if they watch professionals or they watch it at their elite level, they've got a handlebar to hang on to. They know what's actually going on. I think part of the issue is arts education. It's not well enough taught. I know this is a hobby horse of one of many of my colleagues, but it's not actually very well. It's not taught enough or well enough a lot of the time in the schools with the best of intentions. It's not, and they don't. Whereas everybody's out playing sport, so they know what it actually feels like to kick a ball, or hit a ball, or play tennis, or swim, or whatever. They don't actually know what the actual physical sensation and what's going on in your mind when you play percussion, or when you or make a beautiful sound out of a string instrument, or get a decent sound out of a wind instrument. They just or play in a group. It's wonderful playing in an ensemble. It's like this fantastic. It's so much bigger than the sum of its parts playing in an ensemble, and such a lot of kids have never had that experience. So they go along and they come to the schools concerts and they see an orchestra. How many of you have ever been to a concert before? A few hands. A few hands. Most of them have never seen it.
What about then us having more sort of pathways, mutual pathways, with the kind of work that David is doing, and actually, because the problem is if you say arts is, as you say, the zenith of the Sydney Symphony or the ballet, that is a very far removed point, isn't it? What about everything in the middle?
Yeah, art class at school is critical. Physical education is an integral part. I do a lot of work trying to address kids' obesity in primary schools, and trying to get kids out moving is absolutely important. But the other element is teaching kids to express their emotions or their feelings or their beliefs, and that's, I think, something where art is so important and critical at a young age, whether it's getting your kids to colour in when they're 2 or 3 years of age, and it goes all the way through to building things, and creating things, and dancing around the living room. And there's a big disconnect though. There's a huge disconnect between participation in sport and recreation in sport. You know, people who go, 85,000 people running the City of the Surf in Sydney, you know, is that a sport? Probably more of an activity, but the elite guys are absolutely competitive, trying to win. All the way through to the Olympics and so on and so forth. In arts, you've got the incredible performing arts at the highest level, the elite, but then all the way down. You know, my sister does painting and goes along to painting class and absolutely loves it and interacts with her other group of students doing that, and I think that's a really critical and important aspect of the continuum of arts and also sport that have similarities.
I was just thinking when you were talking about rules, you know, you learn what the rules are. I recently had a friend of mine who was over from Europe. She's French and she's an arts person, and she came and watched the Essendon Collingwood game on Anzac Day last week, and she said at the beginning of it, so what are the rules? So for the whole game I was basically trying to take her through what the rules of AFL were. And then we had a conversation yesterday with training squad folk, and I said, so if she was a sports person and I took her to the theatre and she said to me, so what are the rules? Would I be able to do the same thing? And actually I probably would to a degree, because theatre, text-based theatre particularly, it's quite codified. There are rules, and there are a lot of people breaking rules in the same way that people break rules when they play sport, and that's how things evolve. But I think it is a matter of education. If you had, you know, an hour in the morning where you said, well, what are the rules of sport, and an hour in the afternoon where what are the rules of art, then you would probably have a much greater sense of what the commonalities are between the two when you think of things like discipline and skill, talent, expertise.
No, I spent some time in America about 10 years ago when my husband was doing a residency over there, and I decided I'd go and have a look at the instrumental teaching program in Michigan where I was staying, because it was very, I knew somebody in the system. So, and they have instrumental training. Well, the kids can choose. They can do choir, or they can do band, or they can do strings when they're little, and they get a lesson almost every day, and they're actually doing, just like if they were outside playing again, doing, and then you know, in a group, big groups. The big group, well, the first group I watched had 95 children, and I was just. I had visions of anarchy beyond anything I'd ever imagined. With 95 children armed with string instruments, my mind was going berserk, I can tell you. And I saw complete and utter focus and discipline, because the teachers were wonderfully trained, and the kids were having a ball. They were helping each other. It was fabulous. I went from school to school to school, all great. And then that follows through into the middle school and the senior school. The interesting thing I found was that, you know, I'd bump into people, I'd talk to people in planes and shopping centres and all over the place. Oh, I used to play the flute, and I used to play the violin. I go to the concert, and I think maybe that's why there's a lot more philanthropy to the arts. I mean, people are more, it's part of their experience. But there's a really essential difference that we haven't really broached between the two things. Arts are not a competition. It's not competitive. The only time, really, I mean, the worst experience in one's life is always doing an audition to get a job. That's, I mean, it's just so awful you can't imagine, because it's not really what it's about. But you've got to try and be better than everybody else on that day. It's a pretty grueling process, because there'll be, you know, I can remember doing one audition where there were 200 people after one job. I'm sure that's, you know, the trouble is there aren't very many jobs to go for, but certainly there'll be a lot of people, and it's all behind the screen and whatever. But that's the only time it's actually a competition.
But it's competitive against yourself, surely.
Absolutely, absolutely. But what you do on a day-to-day basis is not a competition. You're not trying to win. You're trying to be part of whatever group, or you're trying to do the best you possibly can, but in the context of hopefully supportive context
Of the team sport.
I mean, the better the collegiality of the context in which you're working, the better everybody will play. There's no doubt about that, and there's research to back it up. but it's the competition is in your mind, really. I mean, you know, you'll say somebody comes off stage and says, that was actually great. Oh no, look, I missed this and I missed. Oh, did you hear? And they'll spend the rest of the week beating themselves up over some note that nobody noticed. But that's well, I'm sure that's a familiar. I'm sure everybody knows that. But you know, it's your own perfectionism. But it's not per se a competition. And the technique of doing it. We learn technique. You learn to do incredibly complex things on the different instruments, different colours of sounds, amazing gymnastics, up and down fingerboards, all of that. But that's not. That as my teacher said to me once, Philippa, the technique is only a means to the end. An end. It's not an end in itself. It's simply something you use in order to be able to express yourself and interpret the music to communicate with the audience, to reach the audience and move them, engage them, whatever it is. And that's the same in any art form. It's the same in acting. I mean, you can't do all the acting and talk down like that. You've got to reach the audience. You've got to move them. You've got to engage them in the character. The same thing with music. I mean, it's about the joy of it. Is you know, when you do a great performance, the real joy of it is that incredible response you get, and the audience goes berserk at the end, and they stand up better still. You know, because it means that you've reached them. That's what it's about. That's the buzz.
I just wanted to, because I'm very interested in the idea of competition in the arts, because I think it's one of the things that that has actually entered into the arts through arts agencies, for example. There's a lot. It's incredibly the language of sport, the language of corporations has actually entered into the arts, and artists are told to be competitive with each other in order to get money. But I think that might be a separate discussion. But what I was curious about is, does the Sydney Symphony Orchestra want to be better than the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra?
They're not.
But I tell you, you probably have a lot of people watching if you had a competition between the two.
There was an article in one of the weekend magazines where they'd done a blind test.
Yeah.
It was quite, the ranking was quite funny, but I thought the way they'd done, I didn't think the way they'd done it was really quite balanced. But anyway,
Because one of the most famous painting exhibitions is the Archibald, which is a competition.
that's a
Yeah.
competition.
Yep.
But it's a very subjective one. It's not about how many goals are kicked. I mean, it's subjective from the point of the panel who judges it. But you're right, it's a competition.
You know, gymnastics, and there are a lot of sports that are also subjective.
Let's get some discussion going. Yes, yes, please.
Hi, look, this is to Philippa, and actually all of you. I've got a son, professional musician, and top grade musician. He went to the Conservatorium High School in Sydney. He went on to full scholarships, and that was the only way we could afford it. Let me tell you, to the Royal College of Music in London. He went on from there, and so forth and so forth. So his life is tough. When he finished all that, to try and get those gigs, for every gig he goes for, there's 200 people now. Because he's more freelance now. But we were fortunate enough with our children that when we booked them in, say, to soccer or swimming or that, from a small age, you can afford it. Most people in Australia can afford to put me into music lessons, swimming lessons or your local soccer team, yeah? And so they can develop their sport and their things. Music, 1 hour music tuition is roughly around $60 minimum in Sydney. And minimum, and we're really looking at, by the end of year 12, we were paying nearly $150 a lesson for my son, right? And that's because they were masterclasses, etc., etc. But what I'm saying is, unless you're middle class, unless you've got money to start your child off, I started my sons off at 2.5 and 3 with their music, and we sacrificed a lot to afford $100 a week for music lessons. My sister, whose husband's, 2 of them are bus drivers, there's no way in the world they can afford that. We have to find a way somehow that we can make, like America, even introducing or other things.
Or like a scholarship program like at the AIS.
Like that, but even you don't. No. That's not quite what I'm getting at. That's even further down the track.
Initially.
I'm talking preschool and to early years, you know, your early elementary years of schooling, where you can have almost daily music lessons that aren't going to cost the average person
And
a
compromise
lot
the rest
of
of the
money.
family.
And
Yeah.
that is why it becomes elitist, because it's middle class people really who can afford those expensive music lessons.
Are there no clubs in the arts? A club? Because what you're talking about is a soccer club, but there's no.
Music tuition is one-on-one when they're
Music.
forever.
But there is a lot
You
of
can have
sport
sister
that
groups.
there's a lot of sport that is run by volunteers. And I think that's to Rob's point, that you know that people do it for no money at all. So the reason why Auspic
Vocal, yes, I
and
think
all
you
of
could,
those
but
are
music
so
tuition,
cheap is
I don't
because
know, you probably have answered that, but
Well, I
it's
can
paid.
answer that, but I mean, the voluntary thing, musicians earn so little in some cases that they simply couldn't afford to teach for nothing. I mean, you know, the groceries cost the same, and so does the rent, whether you're a musician or a top executive. That's just but I take your point that yes, it is expensive. I mean, I teach obviously, and I sometimes think, my God, it's if you had 2 or 3 kids, and I can know plenty of. I mean, it's often the case. You know, you don't just have one of your children taught; you have several of them. It's expensive. It's expensive, and people who don't have an awful lot of money, well, you know, we sometimes. I mean, I know I sometimes bend the rules and just, you know, I charge a different amount or something like that, you know, or forget to charge it at all, or whatever. But on an ongoing basis, it's difficult. Let me give you another example of another situation where I taught. I studied in London for a while, and I taught with the Inner London Education Authority. Slightly before Margaret Thatcher came into power, and they had a wonderful program. I worked in the Inner London area, which was at that stage largely a lot of it quite underprivileged, and they had free. They paid the teachers, and we went and we taught them in small groups, which was interesting. But any child. So long as we thought Mum and Dad weren't going to actually go and sell the instrument at the market on the weekend, which was sometimes an issue, but on the whole, any child could choose to learn an instrument, and we'd go in and we'd demonstrate, this is what a violin sounds like, and somebody would demonstrate a guitar or a trumpet or whatever. You can choose. And I had kids in the class. I had a little boy whose family had just emigrated from Bangladesh, and they didn't have much money. I had another little girl whose father was in the House of Lords. And everything between. But lots of kids living in housing commission places who simply learning an instrument simply would not, like you say, wouldn't have been on the radar. And a woman called Sheila Nelson had a wonderful program at Tower Hamlets in the East End, and that was a very underprivileged area at the time. And I went and watched that, and I know that quite a lot of kids actually out of that program who would never have gone anywhere near being able to play at professional level actually ended up in the profession, because they got the opportunity at the beginning. So yeah, it's a good point. It makes me very sad.
Their child into soccer, and he's a very good top state soccer player now, but minimal fees along the way, you know.
But it does. But it requires the vision on and the money on the part of government and education bodies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'll come to you next, quickly.
Sorry,
not quickly, go, but no, you've been waiting a while, don't be
The
quick.
community aspect and the education aspect, I mean, it doesn't matter about your skill. A lot of people can go and kick the football with their child or their neighbour or their niece or whatever. They can throw a frisbee, that kind of thing. We don't have enough just general engagement with music in the home life, which I think stems through the education system. So just to sing along, just play the guitar. So you start to pick up your skills, which means which means that you've got a little bit of a leg up and a bit of assistance and self-motivation in terms of before you start putting the money into private lessons, which can be spread out to having 3 or 4 children in a group rather than one-on-one. So I bring it back to education, community, and not that elitist attitude, I can't do it because I'm not talented.
There are so many things that come up in this great conversation. Just on the last bit there, of course, in Latin America there is this thing called La Sistema, which is totally about getting instruments and music education into the hands of the poorest kids in Latin America. A couple of years ago at the World Summit on Arts and Culture, there was a woman from a border town in Mexico where they were putting a guitar in every child's hand in the city, and when they had their annual concert, they all celebrated because nobody got killed in the city that day. That was their benchmark. And it was, so you see this at sort of social extremes. In the 70s, I had the very good fortune to work with a woman called Leela Rankin, who was an Aboriginal musicologist, and she put together the Aboriginal Orchestra, which had girls who were on the street, and she was hauling them off the street and putting a violin in their hands. They couldn't play for nuts, but it was there as a group. There was one little Vietnamese boy who'd been adopted by Celtic-looking parents, and he associated better with the orchestra than he did with his own family. And out of that came bands like The Wrong Side of the Road and a couple of jazz bands. So we find that in extremes you get this much easier access, but not as a norm, and it probably should be a norm. Just a couple of, and I think there's a differential also. Every now and then there's a recommendation that sports scholarships here be the same as HECS everywhere else, and everybody says, oh, but you know, not all the kids that learn sport here, not all the young people will ever become famous enough or rich enough to pay it off. And you look in the arts and you find people in their 40s that have never been able to pay off their HECS debt. So there's a sort of strange differential around that. The other couple of things that came up for me is the business in the arts is that there's no umpire. And nobody really knows. That's exactly it, David, that there are certain rules. You can tell when a singer hits a bum note, and you can tell when a dancer falls over, and something funny happens on stage. But actually, apart from that, you don't really know what the rules are. And so that's that complexity and subtlety and nuance that you were talking about, Rob. And, you know, just a couple of things that occurred to me while I was talking. I was rehearsing a show once at the Adelaide Festival Centre, and we all broke the rehearsal, ran over to the green room so we could watch Kieran Perkins swim that mighty dance. And it occurred to me at the time, has there ever been a group of sports people who rushed over to see Joan Sutherland hit that note? and it's just not an equivalent response at all. I also find that in my own work, having done a number of solo one-woman shows, that, and I did want to ask you about that, Rob, because I admire individual singles tennis at the elite level so much. I don't know what it must be like. I sort of do, but not even quite, to be out there for 5 hours in the men's singles, not being able to talk to anyone, going down, I mean, the mental resilience is unbelievable. I guess it must be the same for long distance.
That's what you dream of. That's it. It's not nothing. It's not something to avoid. That's what you strive for.
To go into that zone.
Absolutely, yeah.
But also those ups, because I mean the psychological side of it as well.
Isn't there a mental battle
There's
going
so
on?
much of a mental battle, and as Robin says, when you watch a men's final that goes for 5 sets and 5 hours, and the swings in terms of who's in control, it's when you're saying that's when they are the happiest.
And you cannot allow any emotion to rise or affect you. You know, you are so focused on the doing and the strategy and all of the other nuances of the performance that there is no fear, there is no jubilation, there is no emotion at all until you finish, and then you allow the emotion to come
I wonder
through.
if either of you, both in a long symphony when you're an hour and you can't talk to anyone, or in a marathon run, I wonder if you've ever experienced the thing I did on stage, which is of a parallel life.
Oh, yes.
I'm on stage for like an hour in the first half, and I realised that at the interval that I've thought of things while I've been singing and speaking and doing. I've thought of things, but I will never ever think of them again and never communicate them to anyone. But there is a whole other life that goes on when you're in that kind of isolated, almost meditative zone.
Absolutely, on a regular. I mean, I find this fascinating that you don't talk about that, because the whole thing that goes on when you're performing. I mean, one of the things you have to learn to do is to focus and to go into that state of, if you like, that state of flow where you're just doing and there's no interruption. But the thing you battle against all the time is that voice in your head saying, watch out, there's a bit coming up here, don't muck that up, don't, oh God, what am I going to have to do? Focus. So there'll be all, and yes, thoughts that you had, you get to the end, occasionally, if you're really tired especially, you'll get to the end of a page, God, did I play that or not? Nobody's kicking my desk part. So what happens when your desk partner hasn't kicked you, say, what the hell are you doing? So obviously you must have. But at the same time you were thinking about, you know, something you did 20 years ago, or you get better and better at not allowing that to happen. I mean, you just simply don't entertain that voice. You go back and you focus, and over time you learn. But I can remember as a younger player really battling that, and this voice of doubt. You know, that there's that one that talking about tennis, that book, The Inner Game of Tennis, by, I can't think, but it's gone. But Barry Green, a double bass player in America, wrote another one in conjunction with him called The Inner Game of Music, which was one of the earlier books about what was going on psychologically when you were playing. And he did a funny skit at a conference I went to in Hawaii. That was a nice gig. But he had a tape. Cassette tapes in those days, just like you. and he was standing up there with his double bass doodling away while the tape was saying what was going on in his head. Now, all of us who were performers were nearly paralytic on the floor with laughter, because what was going on in this tape was exactly what went on in our heads when we were... There's this battle all the time.
Could I just add one more, and that I've discovered a festival in France that was a legacy of the Lille European Capital of Culture, which is both art and sport. I think you've spoken a bit to them, David, and they do some really interesting work in the sense that it's every 2 years, and they have arts events and sports events, and some that are combined, like instruments made out of bicycles, etc., etc. But during the year, they do an enormous amount of crossover legacy. They take sports fans to arts events, they take artists and arts fans to sports events, and try and get some sympathy going. I think, David, I don't know if you've got any more detail on that, but it does sound very, very interesting. I think you can find it online if you just look up Sports Lille.
I think that goes back to a lot to the Olympics, and you look at the Barcelona Olympics, and that was just, you know, the three tenors, and I mean the Pavarotti. It was just an incredible amalgamation and unification of art and sport.
Because that goes back to Greece, does it not? There
absolutely.
were competitions for poems, competitions for music. There was actually Olympian cultural competition.
I need to go back to that. No, we'll take probably, we've got to wrap up relatively soon. Sorry, I don't rush you. Yes,
I'm from a running background, but it's interesting listening to all this. There just seems to be so many similarities, or not similarities, parallels between art and sport in terms of the physical and emotional and spiritual journey that you go through when you're doing both. And I come from both the sporting and artistic background. And it's funny, you were saying about you go into a different world of thought or something, and you go, oh, hang on, have I just been playing for the last 10 minutes or whatever? Because I was on a training run this morning. We were talking about this very thing where you can be running for half an hour and then suddenly go, how did I get here? You just sort of drifted off into another world. And it can happen in racing too, and you talk about emotions, and sometimes they can also be powerful things, and I'm sure it's the same when you're playing an instrument or acting or whatever. You actually can use the emotion while you're either performing or you're racing or doing whatever sport you're doing to actually help you. And I've noticed there's also, we seem to think of this disconnect between art and sport, but in art, you have an incredible physical endurance and a stamina that you need and strength. And in sport too, I mean, you look at a top soccer game and don't tell me there's not art in some of the things those players are doing, and you go, that's not, you don't need to do that the way you just did it. That's art, that's a performance on the field. And just getting back to what we were talking about earlier about this idea of 85,000 people doing city to serve, and I think of when I was growing up, no one would ever have a go at you if you went and kicked a footy, even if you were, well, they might laugh at you if you were useless at it, but there was no laughing at you because you had a go in sport as a kid. But I think of so many times in my life where I was strung into a song and all your mates is going, oh, don't give up your day job and that. And there seems to be this sort of, in our culture, particularly our modern Western culture in Australia, there seems to be this inability to be able to go down, say if you go to a pub or a cafe or something, and just everyone has a sing-along or something, and I think
and I love that idea about the sing-along.
Sorry, it's that inability somehow that's come into our culture where we're able to go and just kick a footy round or go for a run and no one sees that as odd. Yet if you went into a pub or a cafe and started singing with a mate, people look at you and go,
There is an
that's strange.
emasculation of the arts.
Yeah.
Yes, let's take a few more comments and then we'll get final comments from the panelists. Yeah.
Just a comment really, I suppose if you do go to a pub, you could go to a karaoke event, you know, where people do get completely wasted and sing along. I just wanted to comment really that maybe there's been a lot of discussion about particular kind of legitimised and high art, and some of the best paid artists are popular musicians or film actors, and a lot of the most popular sports are the big pop, you know, are the ones that make a lot of money. You see a lot, tennis players, football, whatever. But there's also like archery, which doesn't have such a popular backing, but somehow is supported by the greater thing. So I just wanted to comment that maybe there is a lot of participation and in the arts, but it's not legitimised in the high art way in the same.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yep.
Rob, you mentioned the Archibald as a populist event, arts event, which really brings the community together, you know, looking at art and participating in art. And it just sort of hit me that you mentioned the City to Surf as being a spectacle sport. You're asking an art critic, and the Archibald is more of a spectacle than a good quality exhibition. And I think that's really interesting because if you actually read like the Herald's or the Australian's review of the Archibald, you know, they're critiqued quite heavily, and a lot of people get in names who the subject is, the popularity of the subject, the artist, and so the spectacle of that brings that element of competition into the arts, which I think can be a bit dangerous in terms of that some people will start to paint certain ways, certain subjects, because they're going to get a pat on the back, that recognition.
Or the populism.
Yeah.
Hi, I work in the area of sport in the psychological realm of helping athletes, not necessarily professional athletes, but in some of our lesser known Olympic sports. And it really strikes me that where the arts can infuse sport as well is to your comments regarding an elite athlete on the day being able to perform. It sounds like you have some innate psychological characteristics that just make you die to get over the line.
He's a freak.
Yeah,
you're right.
Athletes try to develop that, where some athletes don't have those psychological skills. They're more performers and less competitors. And so where I find my infusion with some of our athletes is around how do we take you out of the competitive realm, because when you're truly competitive, a lot of your mindset is around stuff you can't control. You can't control what your opponents are doing at a given moment, unless you're an AFL player and that opponent's going to run you over. But in a case like running, what are you going to do, trip them? So it's a lot of my discussions with athletes are around you as a performer, and it seems like we could learn a lot in sport from the performing arts around how do you get to be the very best you can be and do what you can do that's in your control. And in order to produce that result that you want in the competitive vein. And so I see it's fascinating, the either ors. You know, we do have rules, we do compete, but at the same time we're individual performers. And in my realm, there's a lot I'm learning that I think arts can inform sport about, making sport, at least in the mind of the individual, more like art, and that actually will elicit a better competitive performance in the end. And so I see a lot of nice fusion there.
What we might do is get everyone to just wrap up now in terms of their final comments. And I'm fascinated by the psychology of it, because you see Rob, who's so clearly, he doesn't understand anyone wanting to be anything other than the best. But then I see someone like Sam Stoser, who's constantly undone by her head. So it's not simple for anyone, and there's so much where we can, where we can learn from one another. But let's all just have a concluding remark, because I know we are already running a bit over.
Sure. Okay. I still find it fascinating. Sport offers individuals and community so much. At the elite level, at the recreation and the participation, at the masters, at the kids level. arts to me also should offer so much to all of us to make our life richer and more inspiring and more celebratory. Sport to me, like I said, is very simple. And I think that all of us as parents and as community leaders or as teachers, as friends, have an opportunity to try to instill some of the artistic values into our sportsmen and women. And there are elements of sportsmanship that are suffering these days. And I would like to see the artistic element of sport strengthened. And I don't see that there's anything wrong with having a competitive element coming through in the arts as well. But I really hope that the arts do have an opportunity to influence and contribute significantly to sport at all levels, and I believe it can. And obviously, I guess it goes the other way as well. But I don't quite understand that contribution or the need within the arts. But I see it very strongly within sport.
Yeah, well, I'm just sort of thinking about, we spend a lot of time saying, the sport's this and the arts, but I can't think of a society where there isn't, or any now or anywhere in history where there haven't always been both. There's always been some sort of activity that people did physically as a group. There's always been art, writing, painting, even on cave walls. There's always been art. There's always been sport. They coexist. It's not a case of one better than the other. They are part of human need and existence. They have to. If you're going to have a healthy culture, they both have to be there. And just going back to this psychological side, I think I teach, something I didn't touch on, I suppose, was the fact that it's very much a one-to-one thing. I've thought a lot about teaching in groups, but beyond the very beginning, everybody's needs are different. It's trying to do the same thing with everybody at once would be impossible. But because you have this one-to-one relationship that you develop with students, often over a very long time span, and you have to deal with whatever their demons are, that their psychological sort of, and it's so different. There's just such a range. Some people are like you. It just, it doesn't. Nothing phases them. They can just do it. Others, it's just getting them on stage is such a battle. You've got to deal with every obstacle they'll throw at you. There's a huge amount of difference. But I imagine there's enormous scope for cooperation between the two areas in terms of what's going on psychologically. Simply so the whole point of it is to get them in a state so that they can do the best that they're capable of. That's actually what it's about. So that they can actually deliver what they're capable of delivering and don't get in their own way. That's certainly an area I think we could explore.
David?
Just following up on your comment, and really I think the connection is through process. I think one of the main things that arts offers best is process as opposed to outcome. Because often I think when you work in sports, you're very much looking at the outcome. However, the outcome is only determined by the process. And when I look, for example, at the training squad, who group of people haven't met each other, we work for 2 weeks to build the show. Essentially, when we do the show, when you see it outside, you're going to see the physicality, the gesture, the movement, the talking. The thing that I look at, what I think is happening, is actually the connections between them as they attempt to do the things that they are trying to do together as a team. And that's based on a physical performance practice which has come from very many different influences. But for me, when if the outcome isn't necessarily the best outcome, it's only to do with the process. It's actually to do with an attention to processing a series of communications between each other, and so it's all about human agency. And that's ultimately the relationship between sport and art for me. It's actually human agency. And just one last thing, a couple of months ago I asked a a child of one of my neighbours. I said, "So what sport are you doing?" And she said to me, I said to her, "What sports are you doing?" And she said, "Oh, ballet and basketball."
What a perfect place to end. I feel I've been vindicated completely. Just what a great discussion. I hope it's got us going. And you know, I think it's interesting. I come from Melbourne. I live in Melbourne, where everyone thinks we're sports mad, but more people go to musical events every weekend than they go to the football. So there's something to think about. Thank
Ladies
you so
and gentlemen,
much.
will you please thank our panelists?
Canberra one.
Centenary.
Beautiful.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Only girl, 8-year-old, she was more sporty.
Thank you very much.
I'll see you later. I remember we were watching her doing a ballet sort of lesson, and the teacher was going around all the good He said, "Oh, well, do that one later."